Yes, Tom, you called me, I announced as I entered the managing director's office after he called me through the intercom. Yep, thanks for coming, Mike, he replied with a smile, standing up from the table. I want you to meet George, whose company is interested in our new gearbox. Nice to meet you, I said, extending my hand in greeting as he began to rise from his chair to face me. And suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. Mike, George muttered in surprise, George Campion to be precise. Mr. Campion, I answered formally, also surprised, and lowered my hand. Are you too familiar? Tom smiled, apparently not noticing the hostility that existed between us, or we were simply too shocked to show it clearly. How do you know each other? Mike worked for me a few years ago. George, or Campion as I always knew him, beat me to the punch by telling the truth, but leaving out our more contentious past. This will make things easier, continued Tom, a brilliant engineer but not a very good person, and still not understanding how awkward the two other men in his office suddenly felt. Perhaps you could show George our production. Maybe, I muttered, turning my back on Campion and heading for the door, leaving him to decide whether to follow me or not. He followed. I think he had to, and I walked quickly down the hallway, hoping he'd have a hard time keeping up with me, deliberately not stopping until we were out of the office and alone at the edge of the parking lot. What the hell are you doing here? I growled angrily, turning to him, not caring at all that he was bigger than me, and that perhaps this was the cause of the tension between us. I swear, Mike, I didn't know you worked here, he sighed, raising his hands in a peace sign. We haven't heard from you for several years. We weren't even sure you were still alive. I almost died because of you, I snapped, wondering why I still hadn't beaten him like I should have done all those years ago when I still had all my fingers. Sorry, he sighed, shrugging. What more can I say? I stared at him, holding back the urge to throw a single blow, the kind of blow that would send him to the ground and not allow him to rise for some time. He knew it too and stood there nervously, but without making any movement to defend himself. If he had known how much easier I could hurt him compared to the last time we met, he might not have stood there like that. If he had known about what I had been involved in over the years, he might have run away completely, looking at the horizon. It's in the past, Mike, he broke the silence, almost choking on the words. A lot has happened since then. Lots of blood, too, I muttered under my breath, gritting my teeth but feeling my inner anger subside until I felt like I was breathing calmly again. It's a pity that none of it was yours. How's the bitch? All right, Campion replied curtly, ignoring the insult I had thrown at his wife and showing no desire to speak further about her. Perhaps not all was well in the Campion household, and that did not upset me. And yours, that is, a child? She's fine, Mike, he replied, suddenly perking up and risking a smile. Ginny is already 4 years old, and she is a happy and beautiful girl. Who does she look like? Big question, one that the elephant in the room would ask if it were there. She looks like Jenny, Campion replied confidently. Not at me. Not really. And not on you. Not enough to notice, he answered quietly. Okay, let's go check out the factory, I muttered, turning my back on the bastard and walking away, again not caring whether he followed me or not. I went to one of the best universities and graduated with a good degree in engineering, but at that time I was not sure what career to choose. I think I was as surprised as everyone else when I became interested in the Army recruitment that was taking place at our university in the last year, and even more so when I signed up for short-term service with the Royal Engineers. I immediately became an officer and undertook to serve for 3 years in the Queen's service, with the option of making the service permanent or not at the end of the term. These turned out to be the best 3 years of my life, despite the fact that there were no serious conflicts at the time. The sense of camaraderie was as I had never experienced before. I rose to the rank of captain, but decided that at the end of 3 years, despite efforts to keep me, the Army was not my calling. Frankly, I just couldn't see myself killing anyone if fighting broke out, which it certainly would at some point, and I would be in a position where I would have to do it. This is despite the fact that my skills, especially with a pistol, surprised me. If I had known then how easy it would actually be to use the weapon in real-life circumstances, I might not have left so willingly. After I left the army and suffered the hangover that my fellow officers saw fit to give me as a parting gift, I discovered that 3 years had not been in vain. My time spent repairing tanks in the field with my unit, coupled with my engineering qualifications, proved useful in landing a job with one of the companies that made them. They might not have been tanks, but a range of armored vehicles that had become increasingly necessary as conflicts began in the Middle East and elsewhere. I've never been a pure engineer, more of a fix bugs and make things work type of person, and this, plus my time in the army, made me the ideal person to work with our clients, be they British or otherwise, often in some terrible places. Life was good and getting better when I caught the attention of Jenny, the boss's secretary, and even better when we realized the feeling was mutual. 3 dates, and since neither of us were virgins, we ended up in my very comfortable bed, no questions asked. Another 6 months and a lot of time in bed, I proposed, and she said yes, and we became Mr. and Mrs. Mike Jones. My seemingly happy and relatively carefree life continued as we settled into our new home, albeit with a huge mortgage, and 2 years later I found out I was soon to be a dad. Oh bliss, it was something we didn't plan for, but as soon as Jenny's belly started showing, so did my happiness, and the whole world seemed perfect. And then suddenly he stopped being like that. You need to know something, Mike, Jenny surprised me one evening. What's wrong, honey? I asked, admiring her soft blonde hair as I stroked it. It concerns the baby, Jenny muttered. What's wrong with him? I demanded, suddenly panicking, afraid of what she was about to say. Nothing, she replied sharply, confusing me. So, everything is fine with our child. What is the problem? That's the problem, Jenny sighed. This may not be our child. Nonsense, I laughed, not understanding what she could be thinking. Of course, this is our child. I mean, honey, my wife whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. This may not be your child. I stopped laughing, and frankly, I stopped breathing. I'm sorry, Mike, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. Who is the father? I asked, holding back my tears. It could be you, Mike, she avoided the obvious question. Or, I squeezed out, almost choking on the word. George, she sobbed, sounding like a death sentence for our marriage. George, of course, was George Campion, her boss and mine at that time as well. When did it start? I asked, close to crying, but it was the wrong question, because it wasn't a question of when they started, but that they never stopped. They didn't stop when we first started dating, and only slowed down a little after we got married. My wife has been sleeping with our boss since she was 19, when Campion took her to celebrate her birthday and ended up seducing her. No wonder she decided it was best for us not to discuss our past sex lives. That night my life changed, and perhaps I changed too, and some might conclude, not for the better. Perhaps it would have been better to beat the scoundrel and forget about it. Then I might not have committed other actions for which I am now ashamed. Perhaps the fact that he was also a former military man, not an engineer, but a Marine and a martial arts champion, of course, influenced my decision. This is what I discovered when I burst into his office the next day. I ran out of the house, afraid of what I might do if I stayed. By the time I got home that night, having had quite a bit to drink, Jenny was already in bed, and I was sleeping on the couch. She got up before I woke up and obviously decided not to wake me. Perhaps it was her mistake, because if she had woken me up, perhaps we could have worked out something. I finally got up, showered, got dressed, and sat down, wondering what to do next. My beautiful little world was destroyed, and destroyed by the person I loved most in the world. I went for a hangover drink at lunchtime, irrationally snapping at the bartender who was too chatty. That's when I decided to go and confront George Bloody Campion, perhaps to get his side of the story, although I had no idea how that would help. Perhaps I had other plans. I drove to the factory, past the guards at the gate, half expecting them to refuse me entry when I showed them my pass. I entered the building, nodding to the receptionist and several colleagues, almost not understanding how they could act as if nothing had changed when the world collapsed. I did not go to my office, but went straight to the principal's office, ignoring the secretary as I passed by, barely hearing her exclamations that Mr. Benedict Campion was busy and could not be disturbed. Would I have been better off listening? I opened the door, walked in, and froze. Campion was indeed there, surrounded by his 3 other directors, so it was no surprise that his secretary was there too. The 3 men's attire was formal, as expected, even their ties were intact. The secretary, Jenny, my wife, was wearing her high-heeled work shoes, a pair of not too flashy earrings, and not much else. Where the rest of her clothes were, I had no idea. "Crap," Campion muttered when he saw me. The rest of the room, including me, froze in shock. "Nothing is happening," Jenny muttered, which seemed like a pretty stupid statement considering she was standing there completely naked among 4 clothed men. Oh God, she was so damn beautiful, and I will never enjoy that gorgeous body again. I will never caress those breasts again. I'll never be in it again. "It's not what you think, Mike," she begged, tears already streaming down her cheeks as she took a step towards me. And this was not the case, as it turned out. Campion delighted in showing off his beautiful young mistress to his colleagues, regularly urging her to pour them drinks topless or completely naked, but not allowing them to even touch her, let alone have sex. But I found out much later, not that it changed anything, and not that it stopped me from turning on my heel and leaving their lives before I burst into tears of grief in the parking lot. Finally, I felt the engines of the DC-3-like aircraft slow down, the nose of the aircraft lowered, and again there was a flawless landing, which, given the condition of the grass runway I had entered, was a significant achievement. At dusk, I was led to the edge of the runway into the cover of the surrounding vegetation and heard the roar of the plane's engines as it accelerated again along the grass strip and took off into the air. I was about to ask why he flew away so quickly when I received the answer. A shell, probably a mortar, exploded with a blinding flash just a few hundred yards from where I was standing. It would not have hit the plane, but the second shell might well have done so. "Let's get out of here," suggested my guide. "And welcome to hell, by the way." I didn't need to repeat the invitation. It was truly terrible. We lived in tents, which had to be moved frequently to avoid detection. The temperature was slightly lower than in the Middle East, but the high humidity made it almost unbearable. Insects were everywhere, some of them so big they looked like chickens. Okay, I'm exaggerating about the chickens, but you get the idea. In addition, we had to constantly survive shelling while our enemies tried to spot us. It's not a good time to find out that things aren't going well for us, although I would have realized that quickly myself. Double salary quickly lost its appeal, and the prospect of that alluring bonus seemed like a ghostly dream. The problem, of course, was that you couldn't just say, "I've changed my mind. Please take me home." If I wanted to get out of here, I had to try to survive the 6 months I had signed up for and pray that Vladimir and his old plane were still intact, or hope that luck would turn on me. The situation got better and then got worse again. My team of mechanics, some of whom were locals, a German, 2 Frenchmen, and 2 guys of dubious origin, had almost lost their enthusiasm. More precisely, they were angry and doubted that they would ever see civilization again. Their future seemed bleak. If I wanted to get out of here in one piece, I needed to give them hope, and that wasn't easy. We walked around the base as best we could, and I was surprised to find that our man Oma was actually with us, although I half expected him to be somewhere in the palace, keeping his distance from the fighting. Perhaps he wasn't so bad. It soon became apparent that most of our heavy weapons were out of service, or as my French deputy said, inoperable, without spare parts to make them operational again. Without them, we had no serious response to the attacks of the gang, as our side called our opponents. They, of course, began to understand this, and their attacks became more and more daring and direct. "You've seen the problem, Captain. What are you going to do about it?" These were the first words Oma said to me as I stood before him, surrounded by his 2 senior officers, one black and one white. "Well, I can get maybe 1 medium machine gun operational if I take all the others apart, but then all the others will be scrapped. Same with the mortars, although we'll have to build our own sights since they're all ruined. Maybe I can repair the old 75mm gun, but I doubt it. Your predecessor said the same thing, but he failed, remarked the white officer. Didn't live long enough to find out, the black added gloomily, not very reassuring. It's still not enough, Omer remarked, smiling despite the difficult situation. We need more. We don't have any more, grumbled the white guy I was starting to dislike. Maybe there is a way, I sighed, almost wishing I would remain silent, quickly realizing that 3 of them were looking at me, waiting for me to tell them how I was going to achieve the impossible. The heavy machine guns that are out of order, the Russians, basically have the same problem. It's part of the trigger mechanism that has failed. If we had 5 of these mechanisms, you'd have 5 extra heavy machine guns. We don't have 5 spare triggers, fool, the white guy spat back. But we could make them, I suggested. The workshop has a lathe and other equipment, and René claims he has experience with it. It might be possible. And what's the problem? Oma asked, smiling at me with a doomed look, realizing that there was a catch here. We need a sample, I sighed. The rest are all broken and deformed. We don't have a sample, shouted my troubled officer, whose name I wasn't even told. I think we have, Alma sighed, realizing what I meant. We still have the last of those machine guns that work. No way, shouted the troubled officer. It's the only one that still works properly. We're doomed without it, so no one will take it apart. Without more firepower, we're doomed anyway, the black officer noted. Take it apart, Captain Jones, Oma ordered me. Let's pray that we can keep them. When things reach their lowest point, that's when real people rise up and change the course of history. At least that's what happens in the movies. Unfortunately, real life is not like that, and if things go bad, they will most likely get worse, and my brilliant idea was a complete failure. We removed the mechanism from the last working machine gun and quickly took it to the workshop where we already had an inoperative machine gun, intending to quickly return it to the front line as soon as a copy could be made. Unfortunately, we discovered that René may not have been as much of an expert on the lathe as he claimed, or the metal we used just wasn't good enough. He tried it. I made 3. 2 did not fit, and the third broke in half when we tried to install it back into the machine gun. We stood there with our heads down, not knowing what else to try as the situation got worse. A sudden burst of fire signaled the start of a new attack on our positions, and we all fell silent, hoping that everything would calm down and that it was just a small skirmish, because if it wasn't, then no cavalry would come to save us. I looked around my group of 8 mechanics and saw every emotion, from despair to calm acceptance of our fate. They all looked to me as the leader. Our defensive firing, of course, began immediately, but without the heavy machine gun, the difference was obvious even to us. Obvious and heartbreaking as we looked towards the defensive perimeter beyond a line of thick trees and bushes, just 200 meters away, knowing that a brutal death awaited us. "Damn it," Rini muttered as we heard our only medium machine gun choke and fall silent, leaving only the pitiful crackle of rifle fire. "They're breaking through," one of my men pointed out the obvious. "They will pass through us." It's hard to convey what such a comment means, obvious but heartbreaking. We all knew what this meant. There will be no mercy. Anyone who survives the first attack will not be spared, as they will take no prisoners. Sadly, one by one, my men boldly took up their personal weapons, a rather motley collection of old rifles and pistols. Not much to counter the 100 or more armed infantrymen who we all knew would soon break through the forest perimeter and enter our camp. My seemingly last thoughts as I pulled out my gun were of Jenny, wherever she was, and whether she would ever know how I met my death in a distant land. Will she mourn me? Will you miss me? What would she tell me right now if she saw my last situation? I chuckled darkly as I imagined her telling me to use the brain God gave me, her standard response when she had no other answer. "Use my brain. Damn it. Sometimes you can't see what's in front of your eyes." "Where is this trigger?" I screamed to no one in particular. "It's not working, Captain," someone shouted back. He's useless. Wrong one, I shouted. Original sample. Several people understood what I meant, and with a satisfying click, the original mechanism fell into place in the Russian machine gun that had remained silent and unused for so long. Ammunition, I shouted, but two of them had already begun to drag a heavy metal box towards the machine gun, which by then was aimed at the tree line, which is how we knew that our enemies were about to attack us. Too late, someone shouted as they broke through, 30 or 40 men in the first wave, firing their weapons all around, their light returning fire from the remaining defenders, not stopping their onslaught. Wrong ammunition, the soldier sobbed, trying to insert the belt into the machine gun as the attackers mowed down the remaining defensive force between us and them. It was then that René showed his true qualities by pushing the other man away, unrolling the tape and inserting it into the right place. Then, standing behind the machine gun, turning it towards the first attackers, who had almost reached us, bullets were flying everywhere. The screams of the wounded were already heard on both sides. Music to my ears. I'm not a very musical person at best, but the heavy crack of that beautiful Russian machine gun was the most wonderful music I've ever heard. We may all die on this day, but we will not leave without taking many of them with us. I didn't have time to think about what happened to that young man who left the army many years ago, not sure he could kill someone. The heavy machine gun cut a path through the attackers, but still a few of them broke through and engaged us. My pistol was hot in my hand as I fired at them at every opportunity. Some of them were so close that I had to shoot in between your people. We were brought down, and then suddenly stopped as my men mowed down the last of them, sometimes literally with antique bayonets. Then the next wave hit, a much larger group, but by then we were more prepared. René was firing short, accurate bursts, and 3 were serving him and providing him with ammunition, while we all thanked God that René knew what he was doing and prayed God, to whom previously we may not have had time to prevent the machine gun from jamming. The truth is that in the heat of battle, you really have no idea what's going on. Maybe some general knows, but we didn't have it on hand, so we just kept fighting for our lives. What we didn't know, of course, was that our attackers had rushed straight into our ambush, although it was an ambush of which we had no idea. The last thing they expected, having broken through our defensive lines, was to stumble upon our heavy weapons far behind the front line. Who would have expected it? This was ridiculous military planning, so ridiculous that it all turned into a massacre as their forces poured into the kill zones and our surviving frontline fighters closed them in from behind. I lost 4 of my men that day, including poor René, but we had little time to mourn them. We didn't know that they were planning their main attack that day, and the truth is that if we hadn't accidentally removed that machine gun from the front line, we would have been defeated and I would have ended up in an unmarked mass grave somewhere in a distant land. This battle did not win the Civil War, but it certainly changed the course of events. News of Alm's victory convinced the various factions to join him, finally seeing a real chance to overthrow his very unpopular cousin. Within 10 weeks, Oma had captured the largest city in the country with relatively few casualties on both sides, or, more importantly for us mercenaries, a gold mining complex, small but without which the huge bonus we were all promised might not have been paid. Personally, I took no direct part in the ensuing skirmishes, but was busy moving our supplies and adding those captured to our inventory. But the day after that first big win, Oma pulled me aside for a private conversation. Brilliant military tactical move with the withdrawal of the heavy machine gun, Captain Jones. He congratulated me, patting me on the shoulder. Total luck, I smiled back. But my men did very well under fire. Nonsense, he smiled, almost unable to contain his laughter. The tactics were perfect. We set a trap, and the enemy was caught in a classic ambush, and we defeated a much superior force. If you say so, sir, I smiled back. I say, he replied, winking at me. This is what the press will hear, and what the world will believe, and what my vile cousin will face when he tries to rally his troops. I simply smiled back, shrugging my shoulders in agreement. Stick to it, Captain, and your entire crew will get a small raise. and you'll get a bonus on top of your bonus." "Consider it done, sir," I agreed, saluting him, wondering if I would have lived to see my bonus if I had argued. The press release did come out, and the world learned of Ohm's brilliant strategy. It mentioned the assistance provided by a junior officer with the rank of captain, but somehow they managed to spell my damn name wrong. Women? Well, what about women? Well, as unpleasant as it may be for some sensitive people, where there are men with money and nothing else to do, you will find women willing to help them with this problem. Olga in Dubai was somewhere at the top of the hierarchy. The women there, in this hellhole, were clearly closer to the bottom. They were almost all jaded, old, available women, and few of them who had not yet reached this stage were on the way to it. In their defense, I don't think it's their fault, but I refrained. There was one, a young African girl, quite pretty, whom I could seduce. But the line was too long, and the status of an officer in such a situation did not provide any advantage. The dollar, pound, or euro meant more than rank or position. Unfortunately, she is unlikely to remain so attractive for long, so I abstained. The situation changed as we moved through the war-torn country. Women and girls greeted us as saviors. Their men may have died in battle or simply lay low. Then my abstinence failed me. I confess having twice taken my prize as a certain conqueror, a prize which, it must be said, was given voluntarily in both cases. It may not have been my best moment, but they both seemed to enjoy it. Then everything changed again. Then Florence showed up. Oh, Florence! Our troops burst into what was flatteringly called the capital, in reality almost a small town, practically without firing a single shot. My contingent arrived a day later, and we began looking for a base and then a place to sleep. Soldiers are what they are, and with the city still functioning on some level, somehow a drinking spot made the list, and the main bar in town fit right in. Of course, we weren't the only ones. The place was already crowded with other troops with the same idea. And where men gather, a certain type of woman also comes, although I was content to just stand and watch the fun go on, sipping on a pleasantly cold, but unfortunately not very good, beer. I knew I shouldn't have interfered, but a girl's scream caught my attention. Pushing through the crowd that had gathered around, I soon found the cause, a young woman who was being roughly treated, and unlike the other available girls in the bar, she was resisting quite violently. I was going to turn away, it was none of my business, and I had no desire to confront the hardened African soldiers who were tormenting her. Large and black, like their comrades who egged him on, they were not going to pay attention to a junior officer, especially a white one. The sound of fabric ripping and a scream of horror stopped me in my tracks, and I turned around to see her bare breasts as he tore off her top, although women's bare breasts were no longer unusual in this bar that night. Except that it was white breasts. I have lived side by side with African troops since I arrived there, and the two women I was with, although nice, were both pitch black. So I can say that I was not racist. But the white breast belonged to a white girl, and there were no other white women there. In fact, I didn't see a single white girl the entire time I was in Africa. It was her breasts that caught my attention, but it was probably her pathetic cry for help that sent me into a frenzy. I told myself I was a damn fool, even as I pushed forward to confront them, using my best officer voice to order them to stop. They, or rather he, stopped, but only to look at me in disbelief. "Mind your own business," he growled, wringing the poor girl's arms behind her back so that she howled in pain, and turned her in my direction, deliberately teasing me with her half-naked body. Her full, white breast stuck out, so beautiful and clean in such a terrible, dirty environment. "Let her go now," I snapped, hoping to sound much more confident than I felt. "Take him away. This stupid white officer is alone," he spat at his comrades, soldiers who had killed without hesitation until perhaps just yesterday, and they advanced towards me with grins on their faces that made my stomach churn. Killing your officers was not uncommon in this conflict, and I internally cursed myself for being such a fool and looked for a way out of this situation. The girl, no matter what the hell color she was doomed to her fate and was not really actually my problem. Please. It could be the pleading tone of her voice, or perhaps her sexy French accent, or it could just be a beautiful young girl begging me. But probably it was her look, bold and decisive, begging me not to leave her. Idiot, damn idiot, instead of turning around, I stayed standing, knowing there was only one way to stop them from beating me to death and possibly killing me. I took out a gun, my little pistol that served me well in 2 battles. They hesitated, then decided that I would not shoot, or if I did, I would not have time to remove more than one of them. One way or another, people are going to die in this bar in the next few minutes, and everyone is frozen, every eye on us, waiting to see what will happen next. Who is first? I spat with feigned courage, waving the pistol back and forth, having already decided that whoever was holding the girl would be the first to go to the next world, even if the others killed me. In response, he wrapped his hand around her breast and squeezed it brutally, causing her to scream in pain, and my senses became clouded, but not enough to stop me from raising my gun and aiming it at his forehead. He was a brave bastard, to be sure. He was already staring death in the face, knowing, perhaps from the way I held the gun, that I knew how to use it and was using it, and from this distance it was hard to miss. I saw the fear in his eyes, realizing that I might have made a fatal mistake, but he didn't flinch, squeezing the girl's breasts again to tease me. As I applied pressure to the trigger, I knew it would end badly, but it was too late to back out. Oh shit, what an end after everything I've been through for some damn woman I didn't even know. Stop, came a deep, commanding voice behind me, and my mind tried to remember who it was. Lower your weapon, Captain, and that is the order, came the next command. You, step back and let the girl go. We all hesitated, and no one moved. Everyone in the room froze, except for the quiet sobbing of the girl. Now, a stern order sounded behind me, and I finally recognized the voice and lowered the gun. The men in front of me also realized who it was, perhaps the only person in Africa at that moment who could force them to retreat. Put your weapon away, Captain, Oma ordered more calmly, stepping between us, glaring at my opponents until they retreated. Whoever was holding the girl reluctantly let her go, and she rushed towards me, bursting into tears. This didn't stop them from giving angry looks, making it clear that the matter was not over yet. Fools, Oma reproached his soldiers. You're lucky he didn't shoot you all. Unlikely, muttered one of them, still glaring at me. You think so? Oma continued. Do you know who this officer is? You don't recognize him? You don't recognize the man who saved your worthless lives in that hellhole just a few weeks ago. Suddenly, all eyes in the bar were on me, which at least allowed me to ignore the pair of soft, bare breasts still pressed against me. The mood has changed. Hateful glances were replaced by smiles. A buzz went through the bar, and suddenly everyone wanted to shake my hand or buy me a drink. Go away and take the girl with you, Oma suggested quietly, not taking his eyes off the large soldier. I'll take it upon myself. Thank you, sir, I sighed gratefully, the adrenaline leaving me and the realization of how close I had been to death returning to me. Now we're even, he smiled. For what? I asked. For spelling your name wrong, he chuckled, and then burst out laughing, his loud laugh contagious, and soon the whole bar joined in, everyone including me, everyone except the poor young woman still clinging to me for dear life. We broke up. We left, and I dragged her down a dusty street until I found a dirty storefront that gave us a little privacy. A pretty topless girl is usually quite vulnerable in any downtown area, much less in a place that was still on the verge of becoming a war zone, especially when they were as juicy as hers. What the hell were you doing in a bar like that? I asked angrily, taking off my shirt and throwing it over her shoulders. I thought they might give me a job, she whined, still clinging to me. Why do you need work? I asked, calming down a little, not understanding how such a young, pretty white woman, probably still in her teens, could be looking for work in such a war-torn area. No money, she replied simply, her French accent becoming less distinct as she calmed down. How old are you? 19, she replied, but I raised my eyebrows questioningly. No, I'm not cursing you, the girl answered me. I've heard women deny that they're bitches with less anger. Her recovery from her terrible ordeal surprised me. I sighed, wondering how the hell I ended up in this position. It's time for some details. Who the hell are you, young lady, and why are you here? I screamed at her, shaking her gently to get my point across. I had had enough, but her explanation, punctuated by fits of sobbing, was sobering. Her father, a Belgian diplomat, was traveling with her to South Africa, where she was to spend the summer with family friends in Cape Town. They stopped along the way for the weekend to let her father attend to some official business, confident that the rebel army was stuck in the south of the country and unlikely to survive the week. Unfortunately for them, some clever bugger took the trigger from a heavy machine gun and changed the course of the war, but of course they didn't know it. Her name, it turned out, was Florence. Our return flight was canceled, and then suddenly government soldiers poured into the city to escape the rebels. Ma and Papa argued with some of them, and they shot him. They killed him. No, she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks at the memory. He lost a lot of blood, but the hospital was still open then and saved his life. A Red Cross plane was flying out, and he was put on it. I just pray he's still alive. Why didn't you go with him? No place. Dad was barely conscious, so I just had to let him go, she sobbed and went on to explain how she returned to the hotel they were staying at and kept a low profile until they stopped. Kicked her out earlier that day, unable to pay the bill. That's how she used to end up in a bar looking for a job to earn some money. No chance, of course, except to lie on her back on some dirty mattress, where she almost ended up anyway. So where are you sleeping tonight? I asked her. Where do you sleep? She nervously snapped back at me. We'll see, I grumbled, trying not to look into those baby blue eyes, or, more importantly, at the swell of her breasts peeking out from the hole in the shirt she was wearing. Where is this hotel? Right here, she replied, pointing out that this might be the best hotel in this area, right across the street from where we were standing. It looked pretty good considering where we were, although in Europe it might have been closed. I grabbed her hand and almost had to drag her towards the hotel entrance, heading towards the front desk as if I owned the place. The woman wants her room back, I told the guy behind the counter, who looked Turkish but probably wasn't. She didn't pay her bill, he growled back, ignoring me and openly staring at the hole in her shirt. It was too big for her. I said the lady wants her room back, I repeated, placing my hand on the handle of the gun, and he showed clear signs that he had changed his mind. Then a handful of local currency thrown in front of him seemed to convince him. And a room for me, I continued, provoking him to refuse. You don't need him, Florence intervened, and this time it was she who took my hand, grabbed my keys from the counter, and dragged me towards the stairs. I didn't resist. I could say I was just tired, but that wouldn't be true. She had big, beautiful, blue eyes and amazing breasts that were bouncing right in front of me. Her ass was. Her legs were. I didn't really stand a chance. So I undressed her, took a shower with her, went to bed with her, and enjoyed the feeling of her beautiful young body. I could have fallen in love with her, and perhaps I did. But when I arranged for her to call her parents in Belgium, which was not easy in this terrible place, and saw her burst into tears of happiness when she learned that her father was alive and well, and heard her mother's cries of joy when she found out that my daughter is also alive. Unfortunately, I had to let her go. I put her on a plane to security 6 days later, telling her that the ticket was cheap, not to mention that it cost me a month's salary. She cried inconsolably from the moment we arrived at the airport until she boarded the plane. I held back my tears until she could see them. The war had to be ended, and we moved the next day. The war died down, rather than ended with a bang. We all received the promised rewards, or the next of kin of those who did not survive received them. I left with money that I could have earned in 10 years in my home country without taxes. All the money was safely hidden in an offshore bank. The question was what to do with them. Well, I spent some of it on a stopover in Dubai, my flight this time being something much more luxurious than Vladimir's old rusty box. My goal was to find sweet Nia, but I came to know that she was transferred to Europe to run a restaurant there a month or so ago. I consoled myself with another Russian girl, maybe not as beautiful as Olga, but no less energetic. It was cheaper, perhaps because I chose a 3-day package. Campion's arrival at my new company, JS Components Limited, which I joined a year or so after returning from Africa, was a complete surprise, although perhaps it should not have been. We manufactured specialized gearboxes and axles, and Campion's company was a previous customer of ours. In fact, I worked with JS myself when I worked for Campion, shortly before Tom took over the company. They haven't partnered with JS for a while, but we didn't have such an advanced gearbox. We made a deal with an American company and started producing the unit under license from one of their designs, which gave us a boost in technology and gave them access to the European market. A good deal for both parties. We essentially developed a clever modification of their MK6 gearbox, which we shared with the Americans, and entered into a co-marketing agreement as the MK7. Things went very well. And then Campion appeared, and all those thoughts that I had kept in myself for many years came flooding back. The things I thought I had left behind began to torment me again. I hated that bitch, of course, I mean Jenny, but the reality was much deeper than the obvious. It was something I had a hard time dealing with. Trying to maintain this hatred after what I had seen and experienced was becoming increasingly difficult. After showing him around the plant, I left as quickly as possible, and Campion was just as happy to stay away from me. The problem was that he needed our gearbox, and the truth, as unpleasant as it may sound, was that a good order from his company would have solved our expansion plans. So Tom, the good old fellow, cheerfully left me to work on the deal with my old friend George. Of course, George Campion. The deal involved equipping 40 of their armored vehicles for one of the little-known North African divisions of the French company. For those in the know, this could mean they could end up anywhere from Syria to North Korea. Money, of course, talks. He wanted a MK7 box, but I convinced him that due to delivery times, he would be better off with a MK6 box, and of course it was a bit cheaper. He agreed, or perhaps fell for it. I may not have been the great military tactician I was made out to be, but in business I had just laid a classic trap for him. A trap that, if he hadn't been so stressed about working with me and had done his homework, he probably wouldn't have fallen into. 4 months later, I found myself back in Tom's office, and Tom looked quite annoyed. "What the hell are you up to, Mike?" he blurted out at me. "You should have known." That Campion's car was going to Syria? I grinned back at him. No, I didn't know exactly, but I guessed it would be something like this. I think it worked out pretty well. "But for God's sake, man," he continued, "the MK6 box is manufactured under license, and there is an embargo on American equipment. How are you going to hide this?" "I'm not going to," I agreed, trying not to smile too widely. "They won't get them." "Damn it, who gave you the authority to do something so stupid?" "Do I really need to answer this?" I asked, keeping my manners appropriate. "Okay, maybe so," Tom sighed. "So you're now the majority shareholder, but I'm still managing director until I retire." Right, that's where my hard-earned money and bonus went. I invested my capital in JS Components and, with Tom's approval, agreed to shares in lieu of salary for a while until I received a controlling interest. "But you'll be retired and sitting on some sunny beach with your wife by the time this all blows up," I reminded him. "Maybe," he relented, "but it could bankrupt us. What the hell are we going to do with 40 half-aged gearboxes?" "3," I giggled back at him, "and they're already in stock." "What?" "All the gearboxes coming through production are actually MK7, and as you know, they are unlicensed and non-embargoed." He knew, of course. Although it was not emphasized at the time, we and the Americans were well aware when we signed our agreement of the benefits of equipment, not subject to their own embargo rules. "So you're going to replace the MK6 boxes with new ones when the problem comes to light," he muttered almost to himself. "Exactly," I confirmed. "But not at the usual price, I suppose." Tom concluded. He was no fool, And for the first time that morning, a faint smile appeared on his face. Additional production costs, order cancellations, retooling of production lines, etc. Everything costs money. The price should be much higher. All costs that we won't actually incur. Exactly, I confirmed. More profit for us and a bigger parting bonus for you, Tom. But why, Mike? He finally asked. That's not like you. The money will be useful, but that's not how JS Components works. Let me tell you a story, Tom, I sighed, sinking at the thought of having to talk about my relationship with Campion and a woman named Jenny. But I did, and in all its sordid details, Tom even winced, feeling my pain when I told him about my last visit to the office and how I found my wife naked with him and his friends. I think I understand, Mike, Tom said when I finished my story. But don't let it change you. Don't let it warp your worldview. I promised him that I wouldn't let him. We opened the drinks cabinet, and he left me alone. The problems began almost exactly 3 months after I met Tom. Campion's company has already received 3 MK6 boxes and has carried out all the engineering work to ensure their vehicles fit these boxes. They demanded more to get the production line up and running, and that's when I hit them. We're having a bit of a supply problem, I told their production manager, luckily a man I didn't know well, having been hired after I left. I hope the delay won't be too long, he replied. We have everything set, and the first shipment should be delivered in a few weeks. When I suggested that he might not get them, he exploded, and I had to wait for him to calm down before continuing. I offered to meet with his boss to solve the problem, which he easily agreed to, not knowing that I wanted revenge at the very place where the problem arose. And so it happened. What the hell do you mean you can't supply gearboxes? Campion exploded. You've been producing them for months. If you let us down, we'll sue you. Problems with the embargo, I answered quietly. What other problems with the embargo? He exploded. The French are our clients. We Brits have no problem with them. But our MK6s are manufactured under license from an American company, and they have problems with a certain party in Syria. As soon as I said these words, I saw that his face turned pale. What the hell? He began to demand an explanation, but fell silent, knowing full well how I could find out about such things. But you should have suspected when we signed the order. Why didn't you say anything? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, I chuckled in response. You're a scoundrel, he spat, finally realizing that I had set him up. You planned it. You fucking planned it. The same way you planned the end of my marriage, I replied angrily, intending to take my anger out on him. I hope you and that bitch are still happy because it might not last long once I'm done with you. I hadn't thought through what his reaction would be, but what I got was not what I expected. Campion, a big macho man, a former Marine, a former boxer, just burst into tears. My anger disappeared, and I stood there feeling only embarrassment. I've seen grown men break down in the heat of battle, but this was different. It just left me feeling uneasy, without the expected satisfaction of revenge. Jenny, he finally sobbed, we are not together anymore. I didn't know that, I told him, my emotions completely confused. I caught her cheating, he explained. I forgave her, but 6 months later she did it again. She promised to stop, but I hired a private investigator and found out that she was dating one of my suppliers. She had been doing this for a couple of years, and the other affairs were just fun on the side. Sorry, I mumbled, not knowing if I was being sincere, but not knowing what else to say. We had a huge row, and I kicked her out, and she went to live with her lover. I couldn't let them get away with it so easily, so I ruined the bastard. Now they live in a cheap rented house and drive an old junkie car. And by all reports, they're pretty miserable. Serves them right, I remarked, wondering if he even thought about the similarity of his situation with mine. But I still love her, Mike, he began to sob again. I miss her every day. Poetic justice, I muttered, but if he heard me, he did not answer. I decided that our meeting was over and nothing more could be achieved that day. I turned and walked out of his office, wondering if he even noticed I was leaving. The next day, I tried to collect my thoughts. My previous plans went to hell after meeting Campion. Apparently, he really loved her, perhaps more than I've ever loved. What did this mean? I planned to cause him serious financial problems and perhaps even drive him into bankruptcy. But now I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. My days in Carl's service changed my view of the world and everything in it. We had a few more meetings, and my plans and intentions again took an unexpected turn. So much for being a great tactician. I didn't have to negotiate a higher price for a more advanced gearbox, and to tell you the truth, Campion and I had very little discussion about it. Instead, to my surprise, I found myself discussing the workings of Campion's business. I just found out that you actually own JS Components. He began our next meeting. How the hell did you do that? I came back with a lot of money from Africa, I explained, without offering any further information about how exactly I earned it. I invested in JS and took over as CEO from Tom a couple of weeks ago, but I only have a majority stake. What about the other shareholders? He asked. Old family members of the original owner. As long as they receive their dividends, they do not interfere. Are you planning to expand? He asked, seemingly casually, and suddenly he had my full attention. Maybe, I replied, trying to be appropriate. Ever since Jenny left, I've kind of lost interest in the business. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have caught me with this embargo. I'm approaching retirement age. Jenny is still a kid and too young to take over the business in the near future, so the business may be up for sale. How many? I asked, not wasting time on unnecessary words, but realizing that my heartbeat was significantly increasing. He named a figure that seemed unexpectedly reasonable to me, but I still made a dissatisfied face. Campion offered a slightly lower amount, and I made a disgruntled face again, but it didn't work the second time. He wasn't that desperate. I'm not sure I can raise that amount, but I'm definitely interested. The banks will help, he suggested. How about half the amount for 51%? I counter-suggested, and he sat looking at me while he thought. That would give you a controlling interest, he apparently noted. That's good, but can I trust you? I sighed and seriously thought about my answer, and realized that I no longer hated this person, and after interacting with him over the past few months, I didn't even dislike him. I specifically checked the situation with Jenny, and everything was as he said. She was, well, she just didn't live in my world anymore. She was unimportant to me. I think you can, I finally said. Trust me, that is. I really think you can. I think I believe you, he replied, smiling and offering me his hand to shake. Checks had to be done to make sure there were no skeletons in the closet, and there weren't. The deal was agreed and completed, giving me the option to buy the remaining shares over the next 5 years. I was to become CEO, and at my suggestion, George remained chairman. It's amazing how easy it was for two men who had been deceived by the same woman to come together. He was supposed to be the chairman who planned to remain mostly in the background to spend more time with his young daughter Ginny, whom he took care of. I was also pleased when I finally met her that, although she was very sweet, it was obvious that I was not her father. Suddenly, from my humble beginnings, I found myself at the head of my own small but growing engineering empire. However, I still had a love life. Casual relationships with very attractive women were fun, but not what I was looking for long term. I needed a nice young woman to become my wife and settle down in some leafy suburb, have 2.5 children, and, of course, a dog. Someday, perhaps. My new position gave me more opportunities to travel, and it was not difficult to organize a trip to Mumbai, where I knew for a fact that the beautiful Neha lived, having returned there to work as a second-in-command in her father's hotel and restaurant business. This is Mike from Dubai, I introduced myself when I called her. Which one? She answered rather disappointingly, although, of course, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then. The one with the scar, I replied, hoping she would remember or I wouldn't embarrass myself. Oh yes, she replied encouragingly. Have you killed any more bad guys since then? A couple, I laughed back, wondering how she would react if she knew how truthful my answer was. We chatted a little more, renewing our acquaintance, and agreed to meet later in the evening. I asked her out to dinner, but she declined, suggesting instead that we go to some trendy bar she knew. Not hungry, I joked. Only for you, she laughed in response. We have unfinished business. Suddenly, I also stopped feeling hungry. The bar was really trendy, very exclusive, and if I hadn't been with Neha, it would probably have been difficult for me to get into it. Neha was just as gorgeous and beautiful as I remembered and greeted me with a searing kiss, as if we were already lovers. You left me very disappointed that night, Mike, she admitted. You're not the only one, I replied back. Let me introduce you to the company, she said, dragging me to the center of the establishment, where it seemed that all the young and rich inner crowd of Mumbai had gathered. The fact that Neha didn't stand out from the crowd spoke volumes about how beautiful the girls were. Mostly petite ones like Neha, sweet, almost fragile faces, and just gorgeous slender bodies like Neha, and yes, competing with each other to show as much bare skin as possible. Like Neha, or Na, as everyone seemed to call her. I went through a whirlwind of dating, but remembered few of the girls' names and none of the men's, and soon found myself being passed from girl to girl on the dance floor, all of whom were eager to meet the adventurous mercenary returning from the war. I have no idea what kind of fantastic story Neha told them, but soon I stopped denying that I was in the SAS, a James Bond spy, a ungeneral, and even an assassin. However, I corrected one young lady who asked if it was true that I was a member of the royal family. The guys were surprisingly accommodating considering how popular I was with their girls, although perhaps the stories, the missing finger, and the scar on my cheek made them wary. As the action heated up, the girls began to remove excess clothing, although there was little to begin with. Then the men, or some of them, started taking off their shirts, the ones with six-packs. There was no way I was going to go down this path, although I had nothing to be ashamed of, but Neha's two friends decided otherwise. While one of them kissed my neck, pressed her breasts against my back, and held my hands behind my back, the other unbuttoned the buttons on my shirt. So perhaps I didn't put up much of a fight, and they soon had my shirt off, gasping in admiration at some scar that was still visible on my chest, and rendering further denials about my alleged abuse pointless. However, I managed to stop them at the last moment when one of them, I think the one with large breasts, began to unfasten the belt on my trousers. The girls, again some of them, not wanting to be left behind by their men, and no doubt under the influence of the alcohol, they had all drunk by then, also began to take off their clothes. Tops here and there, skirts here and there, screams of joy when the first girl took off her bra. One by one, the rest of the girls came to the center of the circle that the crowd had formed, and encouraged by loud applause, claps, and dirty sentences, they danced, swaying their hips seductively and teasing us, until finally they took off their bras, threw them into the crowd, and shook their breasts in front of us. Unsurprisingly, Neha was one of the first, and, dressed in a dress, found herself in only high heels and panties. I was happy to welcome her next to me in the circle, where she joined in cheering the other girls on, not minding where I placed my hands as long as she did so. A select group of us moved into a private apartment somewhere nearby, me without my shirt, which I never found again, several women brazenly walking down the busy street with their breasts exposed as if they owned the place. On second thought, perhaps they, or at least their families, actually owned the place. Neha was with us, or at least I think she was. The alcohol I poured down my throat that night vaporized my brain, and the rest of the night became a very blur. The next morning didn't come for me until some time in the afternoon, and I woke up not knowing where I was. I figured it out for at least several hundred square miles, only then realizing that I was not alone in the bedroom. A fascinating, dark, and naked young woman was standing there smiling at me. "Are you finally awake?" she laughed charmingly. "Unless you're an angel," I grinned in response, not being sure that even a naked angel could be as beautiful as this girl, whom I didn't even recognize for sure was. "Breakfast," she suggested. "Who are you?" I asked, remembering the events of last night. "What are you doing here?" "I drew the long straw," she replied, bursting into laughter at her joke as her eyes dropped to my nether regions. which the sheet didn't hide too well, the humor not lost on me either. Did I measure up? I joked in response. I don't know yet. You were completely passed out when I helped you back to my room, she told me. Where is Neha? You mean nah, she smiled back. I don't know and I don't care. Now what, breakfast or me? The pose she adopted, with her hands on her hips and her firm, small, pointy brown breasts pointed at me, made it clear what she was offering. I did end up enjoying breakfast, but not until 4 or 5 hours later, and you'll see why. The next week or so was incredible. I managed to meet Neha and even spend the last couple of nights with her, although the sex, and there was a lot of it, simply blended in with the week of debauchery I had been enjoying. Eventually, my excuse to stay there ran out, and I was forced to leave India and return to the UK, vowing that I would return soon. I told Neha that I will come back to win her. However, other opportunities presented themselves in the form of a girl from my past, and I never returned and never saw the beautiful Neha again. 7 years later, with India and Africa now just memories, albeit vivid ones, I was running not 2, but 3 successful companies. A mid-sized manufacturing company that fit our profile became available and was added to our stable. A new business based in Belgium and introduced through a close family connection, there now allows me to jokingly describe our business as multinational. And more importantly, I was very happily married to a wonderful, somewhat younger woman, and soon to be a father again, which made me a very content man. My days of violence were now far behind me, with only one difficult choice left to make in a month, give or take a week. The choice was what to name our expected boy, Mike after me or Jean Paul after my wife's father. Either way, he will join his lovely 2-year-old sister, whom we named Florence, and of course it was in honor of her mother. And with that, I hope I have left you with enough clues for you to understand how my story came to such a happy and completely satisfying conclusion when I finally had a real loving wife. A wife who still happily tells everyone how her husband will always be her hero and how he once saved her from a terrible fate. Maybe one day I'll embarrass her like she embarrasses me by giving someone all the details.